Chapter 5, The Form of the Capitalist State. Capital and the State. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels describe, quote, the executive of the modern state, end quote, as, quote, but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, end quote. However, we have already seen in our account of the rise of the capitalist state in the 19th century that the industrial bourgeoisie played very little part in the formation of state policy. The political revolutions and constitutional reforms in the late 18th and first half of the 19th century in Europe, as in Britain, broadened the base of political representation, allowing the big merchants and financiers in particular to play a more active role, but the industrial bourgeoisie remained largely outside the political apparatus, representing its diverse interests through such organizations as the Manchester Chamber of Commerce that petitioned Parliament and sought to influence public opinion, but that had little direct influence over the executive. Footnote. It is important not to ignore the political influence of capitalists. See Ralph Miliband, The State in Capitalist Society, and Kees van der Pijl. However, it is the politicians who establish the consensus among their paymasters on the basis of their own political concerns. It is the capitalist form of the state that underlies the political influence of the capitalists, rather than the political influence of the capitalists underlining the capitalist form of the state. End of footnote. The centralization of the state and the progressive separation of public from private power put political power increasingly into the hands of a stratum of professional politicians and civil servants of increasingly diverse class origins. Although politicians became answerable to their parties, the electoral base of the political parties rarely was a well-defined class. Although politicians became answerable to their parties, the electoral base of political parties rarely has a well-defined class character, nor can their political programs be reduced to the interest of the classes or strata they supposedly represent. The most cursory examination of the historical evidence seems to disprove Marx and Engels' characterization of the capitalist state. In their political writings, Marx and Engels were well aware of the disjunction between the industrial bourgeoisie and the state. In their writings on the revolutions of 1848, the industrial bourgeoisie is one of the least significant political actors. In discussing particular state policies, they frequently note that the state is in the hands of the aristocracy of land and finance that uses its political power to secure its own narrow interests. The Bank Acts for Marx were an expression of the power of the, quote, big money lenders and usurers, end quote, restricting credit in times of difficulty to force up interest rates and to give them, quote, a fabulous power not only to decimate the industrial capitalist periodically, but also to interfere in actual production in the most dangerous manner. And this crew knows something of production and have nothing at all to do with it. The Bank Acts for Marx were an expression of the power of the, quote, big money lenders and usurers, end quote, restricting credit in times of difficulty to force up interest rates and to give them, quote, a fabulous power not only to decimate the industrial capitalists periodically, but also to interfere in actual production in the most dangerous manner. And this crew know nothing of production and have nothing at all to do with production, end quote, Marx. Similarly, the Factory Acts were carried against the vehement opposition of the manufacturers by landed Tories in revenge for the repeal of the Corn Laws, which the industrial bourgeoisie had only been able to secure by mobilizing popular opinion against the state. The apparent contradiction between the claim that the state serves the interest of capital and the empirical observation of the institutional autonomy of the state has led many to reject or abandon the Marxist theory of the state. However, the problem is not simply a problem for Marxists. It is as much a problem for liberal political theorists, who equally have to explain how the institutional autonomy of the state is reconciled with the need for the state to secure the economic and social reproduction of capitalist society. According to Whig interpretations of history, this reconciliation is achieved through the wisdom and far-sightedness of statesmen, but this kind of idealist solution is no more adequate than the reductionism of crude Marxist conceptions of the state, for it cannot explain how the statesman can rise above immediate political pressures any more than can the crude Marxist theory explain how the general interest of capital prevails despite such particular pressures. It is clear that the state cannot be immediately related to the general interest, whether of capital or of society as a whole, as that interest is expressed through the formal and informal representation of particular interests, not least because the political representation of interest is structured by the constitutional form of the state. However, this is not merely a contingent failure that derives from the particular constitutional form of the state. It derives from the fact that the general interest is essentially an abstract concept. Thus, the theoretical problem of the relationship between the state and the general interest is essentially the problem of specifying the relationship between the general interest and particular interest. The key to the paradoxical character of the capitalist state is the distinction between particular capitals and capital in general. Capital in general represents the total social capital that is available to mobilize labor power in the production of surplus value. However, capital in general only exists in the form of particular capitals, and the relationships between these particular capitals are essentially contradictory. When we consider the capitalist system of production from the physical point of view, as the production and exchange of use values, the particular capitals are interdependent, their interdependence expressed through Smith's concept of the division of labor. On the other hand, in the capitalist form of production, the production and exchange of use values are not determined by the planned coordination of production, but by the circulation of commodities as values. The interdependence of capitals appears only in the circulation of commodities. However, this interdependence does not appear immediately in the particular relations of purchase and sale into which the individual capitalist enters, for each particular relation is one of a conflict of interests. The producer of shoes cannot function as a capitalist without the producer of leather. However, shoe producers do not relate to the leather producers as a whole. A particular shoe producer buys shoes from a particular leather producer. A particular shoe producer buys, I think that's a typo. A particular shoe producer buys leather from a particular leather producer. In this immediate relationship, the producer of shoes only has an interest in buying leather as cheaply as possible. The result of shoe producers successfully forcing down the price of leather might well be the destruction of the leather industry, and consequently of the shoe producers in their turn. Thus, the interests of particular capitalists do not merely conflict with one another, but are essentially contradictory. If the capitalist were free to pursue his immediate interest, he would undermine the conditions of his own reproduction as a capitalist. The role of the market is precisely to mediate the contradiction between the individual interest of particular capitals and their interest as part of social capital. The individual interest of a particular capitalist is expressed in his attempt to realize an increased capital by selling the mass of commodities that his workers have produced for as high a price as possible. However, these commodities have been produced without any regard for the social need for those commodities as use values within the accumulation of capital as a whole. The market evaluates the contribution of particular capitals in accordance with their contribution to the reproduction of the total social capital, devaluing overproduced commodities and revaluing those in short supply. The market evaluates the contributions of particular capitals in accordance with those particular capital's contribution to the reproduction of the total social capital, devaluing overproduced commodities and revaluing commodities in short supply. Thus, the general interest of capital appears to each individual capitalist as a barrier to the realization of his individual capital expressed in the competition of other capitals. The contradictory character of the interest of capital appears in the interest of each individual capitalist in the subordination of all capitalists but himself to the rule of the market. The hypocrisy of capital is not a moral failing of the individual capitalist. The hypocrisy of capital arises directly out of the social form of capitalist production. Each individual capitalist seeks, by one means or another, to overcome the barrier of the market. However, the reproduction of capital as a whole depends on the subordination of all individual capitals to the discipline of the market. Thus, the interest of capital in general appears not as the sum of the interests of the individual capitals that are its component parts, but as an external force that stands opposed to the interest of all particular capitals that confront them as a barrier, in the form of competition in the market. Quote, "The division of labor implies the contradiction between the interest of the separate individual and the communal interest of all individuals who have intercourse with one another." End quote. Marx and Engels' German ideology. It is this opposition between the interest of particular capitals and the general interest of capital that underlies the separation of the state from civil society. The authority of the market cannot be maintained merely by the tacit agreement of individual capitals, unless the authority of the market is imposed on all particular capitals. Each particular capital will individually and severally seek to overcome the barrier of the market by suppressing competition, by fraud, and in extremis by force. Thus, the authority of the market can only be maintained by an external power that can meet force by force. Quote, out of this very contradiction between the interest of the individual and the interest of the community takes an independent form as the state, divorced from the real interests of individual and community. End quote. The state, like the market, appears as an external power to which all individual interests are compelled to submit. Quote, just because individuals seek only their particular interest, which for them does not coincide with their communal interest, the latter will be imposed on them, the communal interest will be imposed on them as an interest, quote, alien to them and, quote, independent of them, as in its turn a peculiar, quote, general interest. On the other hand, too, the practical struggle of these particular interests, which constantly really run counter to the communal and illusory communal interests, makes practical intervention and control necessary through the illusory, quote, general interest in the form of the state. The social power appears to these individuals not as their own united power, but as an alien force existing outside of them, of the origin and goal of which they are ignorant, which they thus cannot control, which on the contrary passes through a peculiar series of phases and stages independent of the will and the action of man, nay, even being the prime governor of these. End quote. Marx and Engels' German ideology. The state secures the general interest of capital in the first instance not by overriding the rule of the market, but by enforcing the rule of money and the law, which are the alienated forms through which the rule of the market is imposed, not only on the working class, but also on all particular capitals. However, the rule of the market does not resolve the contradiction between the individual and social interest of particular capitals, but gives rise to periodic crises which call for the substantive intervention of the state. Nevertheless, although such intervention must favor some interest against others, if the substantive intervention of the state is to conform with the state's social form, The state must seek to secure the, quote, illusory communal interest, end quote, against all particular interests. The class character of the state does not lie in the state's expressing the interests of capitalists, but in the duality of money and the state, as the complementary forms of existence of capital and in general. In this respect, Marx was merely following Smith, for whom all proposals for capitalists should be viewed with suspicion. In this respect, Marx was merely following Smith, for whom all proposals from capitalists should be viewed with suspicion, for capitalists are not to be trusted in matters of public policy. Quote, the proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought always to be listened to with great precaution. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public. End quote. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. Not only are such proposals frequently against the interests of the public and of capital as a whole, they are often likely to be against the ultimate interest of their proponents. Not only are such proposals frequently against the interest of the public and of capital as a whole, they are often likely to be against the ultimate interest of their proponents, who can only see the immediate results of their schemes. As Huskisson noted in the parliamentary debates on trade liberalization in 1824, quote, I am quite aware, I shall be told, that the trade is the best judge of our own particular interest, but I deny, as a general proposition, that any branch of trade is necessarily the best judge of the peculiar interests which are connected with their calling. End quote. Huskisson. The capitalist character of the state was determined for Marx not by the subordination of the state to the interests that arise in civil society, but by the radical separation of the state from civil society, and the formal character of state power that is the essential characteristic of the capitalist state form. Thus, Marx did not disagree with Smith's analysis of the capitalist state, but only with his identification of the, quote, illusory common interest represented by the state and the market with the, quote, real interest of individual and community, end quote. In the first volume of Theories of Surplus Value, Marx echoed the famous phrase in the Communist Manifesto, noting that for Adam Smith, quote, state, church, etc., are only justified insofar as they are committees to superintend or administer the common interest of the productive bourgeoisie, end quote. Civil society and the state. In his earliest writings on the state, Marx contrasted the separation of the state from civil society, characteristic of modern society, with their integration in the Middle Ages. He argued that in feudal society there was no distinction between the state and civil society because civil society was itself organized into corporate bodies, estates, corporations, guilds, etc., that came together in the state. Political organization was therefore coextensive with the organization of civil society. The development of the modern state was marked by the radical separation of the state from civil society. In modern society, the corporate bodies of the Middle Ages have given way to contractual relationships between property owners, and property has increasingly assumed the form of money. The condition for the rise of the modern state is the dissolution of all corporate forms of property, and of all natural, communal, and personal attachments as property assumes the exclusive form of money. The relations between property owners being regulated by the circulation of commodities as values subject to the rule of money and the law. Thus, the revolution that gave rise to the modern state, most dramatically in the French Revolution, was not only a political, but more fundamentally a social revolution. The separation of the state from civil society depended on the dissolution of the political element of civil society, civil society's corporate forms of organization. Quote, the establishment of the political state and the dissolution of civil society into independent individuals whose relations with one another depend on law is accomplished by one and the same act, end quote. Marx and Engels. The individuals who comprise civil society are by no means the asocial monads of natural law theory. The individuals who comprise civil society are by no means the asocial monads of natural law theory. The individuals who comprise civil society's individuality is constituted by the dissolution of all the communal and personal affiliations associated with previous forms of property, as property assumes the abstract and impersonal form of money, and money becomes the mediating term in the relationship between individuals. The capitalist state no longer serves as the supreme temporal power, integrating the diverse corporate interests of civil society. The state is increasingly separated from all particular interests, serving to formalize and to enforce the property rights and money form on which modern society rests. Moreover, the separation of the state from civil society means that the state no longer bestows property rights as it did in the Middle Ages. The state merely gives juridical form to the property rights created in civil society, enforcing those property rights, through the legal forms of the person, property, and contract, and of money as legal tender. Quote, the true basis of private property, possession, is a fact, an inexplicable fact, not a right, end quote. A fact that lies outside the state in civil society. The formal separation of the capitalist state from civil society sets limits to the capitalist state's powers. The state merely gives form to social relations whose substance is determined in civil society, which the state regards as, quote, the basis of its existence, as a precondition, not requiring further substantiation, and therefore as its natural basis, end quote. It is civil society that is the precondition and limit of the modern state, so that the state, quote, has to confine itself to a formal and negative activity, for where civil life and its labor begin, where there the power of the administration ends, end quote. The separation of the state from civil society in no way implies the, quote, neutrality or, quote, the autonomy of the state. The essential feature of the liberal form of the state is the formal and abstract character of state power, most adequately embodied in the rule of law and of money. With the development of capitalism, property becomes its own foundation, and money property's only measure. The formal freedom and equality of the citizen before the law is merely the other side of the formal freedom and equality of the individual in the face of money. The state secures the reproduction of civil society by enforcing the rule of money and the law, which are at the same time its own presupposition. Thus, the liberal form of the state secures the mutual subordination of civil society and the state to the anonymous rule of money and the law. The, quote, independence, end quote, of the judiciary and of the central bank is the most adequate institutional form of the alienated power of money and the law, expressing the complementarity of civil society and the state in providing the constitutional guarantee of the integrity of its forms. The formal and abstract character of the law is the complement of the abstract form of property as money. As we have seen, however, the equality of commodity owners confronting one another in the market is precisely the form through which their substantive inequality is reinforced and reproduced. It is on the basis of the formal equality of exchange that property is accumulated in the form of capital at one pole of society, while propertylessness is reproduced at the other pole of society. The liberal form of the state is the appropriate form to secure the political power of the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie's social power is embodied in the abstract form of money. Quote, the middle classes, being powerful by money only, cannot acquire political power, but by making money the only qualification for the legislative capacity of an individual. The middle classes must merge all feudalistic privileges, all political monopolies of past ages, in the one great privilege and monopoly of money. The political domination of the middle classes is therefore an essentially liberal appearance. End quote. Marx and Engels. The separation of the state from civil society and the formal and abstract character of state power is the means by which the bourgeoisie secures its dominion over both civil society and the state. However, the substance of state power, as the power of a particular class, contradicts its form as expression of the general interest. It is this contradiction that the statesman has constantly to resolve. The abstract character of state power that expresses its separation from all particular interests is the basis on which the liberal state represents itself ideologically as the embodiment of the general interest of society, as the neutral arbiter of all particularistic claims. The universalistic claims of the liberal state are not based on particular theories of government, nor on an accounting of interests, but are the very identity of the state, embodied in the Constitution and expressed in the concentration of military and political power in its hands. Against the universalistic claims of the liberal state, all other corporate bodies that arise to represent the interests of particular sections of society appear merely as the representatives of particular interests. The contradiction at the heart of the liberal form of the capitalist state is practically resolved as the statesman resolves conflicts of interest within the Constitution. However, if particular interests pursue their aims outside the Constitution, they challenge both the authority and the legitimacy of the state. Faced with such a challenge, the state has to maintain its authority, if necessary by the use of brute force, repressing competing powers in the name of the general interest embodied in the Constitution. The tyranny of the bourgeois state is not a deformation of its liberal form, but is inherent in the bourgeois state's need to assert its claims to neutrality and to universality. Liberal political theory and political economy were the ideological forms in which the identification of the domination of capital with the general interest of society was expressed theoretically. However, the theoretical, no less than the political expression of the general interest of capital, can only be represented in opposition to all particular capitalist interests. This is why these ideologies were formulated by thinkers who, whatever their individual class origins, could appear as disinterested intellectuals. The problems that these ideologies addressed did not flow directly from the interest of particular capitalists or even the capitalist class as a whole. The problems that these ideologies addressed were the problems of the Constitution, of the legal, administrative, and financial forms, and of the policies of the capitalist state. Political economy was adopted as the ideology of the state because it gave coherence to a program which resolved the political problems faced by statesmen in a period in which the development of capitalism had established the separation of civil society from the state, and had correspondingly undermined the mercantilist forms of political regulation, leading to a crisis in both the politics and the ideology of the state. Political economy legitimated the abandonment of policies that the state no longer had the authority or resources to enforce, and so the disengagement of the state from political struggles that threatened to engulf it. Political economy legitimated the abandonment of policies that the state no longer had the authority or resources to enforce, so the disengagement of the state from political struggles that threatened to engulf it. Once adopted, it then guided the statesman in the construction of a form of the state adequate to the capitalist mode of production. The theory of political economy identified the general interest of society with the security of property and the anonymous rule of law and of money. This rule was imposed on society by the state through its responsibility for the rule of law and the regulation of the currency. Within this framework, the interest of all particular capitalists would then be reconciled with the interests of society as a whole by the rule of the market. The major constitutional problem was to ensure that the state was in turn subordinated to the rule of law and of money and conducted its duties expeditiously and efficiently. These concerns determined the appropriate form of the state and lay behind the reform of the Constitution, of the forms of administration, of public finance, and of the fiscal and monetary policies of the state. The system of parliamentary representation, with a property franchise, provided a check on the temptation of the state to violate the rights of property and to impose an excessive burden of taxation. The independence of the administration from direct, ideally indirect, parliamentary supervision ensured that politics would not interfere with the task of government. However, the key to the substantive subordination of the state to capital lay not in the system of representation, but in the separation of the state from civil society that underlay the dependence of the state on the reproduction of capitalist social relations. Capital and the development of the capitalist state form. The class character of the capitalist state is not a matter of the subordination of the state to the power of a particular class, but is inherent in the very form of capitalist state power. The historical process through which the capitalist state emerged was not, therefore, simply a matter of the transfer of power from one class to another, but, more fundamentally, represented a change in the form of the state, underlying which was a change in the social relations of production. Although the development of the capitalist state form was associated with more or less violent revolutionary uprisings, these political developments were secondary, as Marx indicated, to the underlying social revolution that dissolved the corporate institutions on which the power of the old regimes was based, as it dissolved civil society into independent individuals whose relationships were based on law and on money. While the origins of the modern state lay in the beginnings of commodity circulation and the appropriation of the means of production as private property, the modern state's full development presupposed the generalization of commodity relations with the generalization of wage labor. The early capitalist class did not seek access to state power for its own sake. Those who aspired to social position and public office could acquire an estate by purchase or by marriage, but most merely wanted to go about their business without impediment, subject only to the impartial rule of law and of money. Thus, the revolutionary aspirations of the bourgeoisie were essentially negative, resisting the subordination of the power of the state to vested interests, which appeared to the bourgeoisie as corruption, privilege, and the abuse of the fiscal and monetary authority of the state. The bourgeoisie sought not the subordination of the state to one vested interest in place of another, although every particular interest sought to enlist the support of the state in its favor, but the subordination of the state itself to the rule of money and the law. The bourgeoisie could unite in its struggle to free civil society from the burden of the state, but when it came to substantive policy issues, the bourgeoisie was by no means unified, for the relations between capitals are relations of competition and conflict. It is precisely because there is no basis on which the capitalist class can achieve a spontaneous unity to express a coherent and consistent class interest that the capitalist class's economic and political unity has to impose on it by external forces of money and the state. It's a typo. It's precisely because there is no basis on which the capitalist class can achieve a spontaneous unity to express a coherent and consistent class interest that its economic and political unity has to impose on it by external forces of money and the state. Where privilege, corruption, and public profligacy presented a barrier to the advance of the bourgeoisie, it might capitalize on popular distress and popular resentment against the burden of the state to mobilize politically outside the Constitution, demanding the democratic representation of property as the means of checking the partisan abuse of state power. However, the revolutionary ardor of the bourgeoisie was strongly tempered by the fear of popular radicalism, particularly after the experience of the French Revolution. The bourgeoisie, like political economy, was more interested in good government, and if good government could be secured without the potential for divisions, turmoil, and unrest associated with elections, all the better. Thus, the reconstitution of the administrative, legal, fiscal, monetary, and financial apparatuses of the state was much more significant for the bourgeoisie than the more dramatic changes in the system of political representation. The reconstitution of the state was ultimately determined not by the political triumph of the bourgeoisie, but by the transformation of the social relations of production. It was the social revolution that undermined the foundations of the power of the landed aristocracy and of the pre-capitalist state, and that provided a new framework for political integration on the basis of the national and international integration of the circulation of commodities and of money. The political struggles to which this social transformation gave rise could only be ignored by the state. The political struggles to which this social transformation gave rise could not be ignored by the state. But the political struggles confronted the state as constraints, not as determinants of the state's development. Thus, it was not the political strength of the bourgeoisie that was decisive in the rise of the capitalist state, but the crisis of the state form. The political crisis required even those autocratic states in which the old aristocracy retained a monopoly of political power to develop new forms of revenue and authority, based on the new forms of social relations embodied in the rule of money. This explains the apparent paradox that the outcome of the revolutionary movements was often a strengthening of the direct hold of the old aristocracy over the state apparatus, as they sought to preserve the vestiges of their social power and to compensate for their social power's erosion by clinging to the state apparatus to preserve a social position whose foundations in civil society had been undermined. The condition under which such a constitutional compromise was possible was precisely the consolidation of the capitalist state form, marked by the subordination of state and society alike to the rule of law and money within the framework of an apparently archaic constitution. The residual powers of the landowning class depended increasingly on the persistence of pre-capitalist social relations and forms of authority in the countryside. The protection of agriculture, preserving not only the power of the aristocracy, but also the subordination of the mass of the rural population. It was only with the generalization of capitalist social relations of production that the transformation of the state form was complete. The political triumph of the bourgeoisie was not the initiator of this transformation, but its culmination. Although the bourgeoisie had contested the tyranny of the absolutist state, the bourgeoisie's democratic enthusiasm was limited, for the democratic constitution was a means of imposing a negative check on the state, a framework within which to exercise the power of money, not a means of exercising the power of the state. The working class had more radical objectives in seeking admission to the franchise. The attempts of the state to subordinate the working class to the money power of capital appeared to the working class in the first instance as a subversion of the disinterested rule of the state by the power of property, leading the working class to confront legality with the demand for justice, the rule of money with the demand for the social and economic rights of labor, and to claim admission to the franchise as the means of securing recognition of its legitimate interests by subordinating the power of property to the power of the state. So long as the state apparatus remained in the exclusive hands of the aristocracy of land and finance, the state apparatus's constitutional stability was constantly threatened as democratic elements of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie allied themselves with the working class demand for democratic rights. Political stability depended on the development of a constitutional form adequate to the universalistic claims of the liberal state. The foundations of such a development were laid with the political assimilation of the bourgeoisie to the nation-state, which was achieved in Europe through the French Revolution, the Napoleonic reforms, and the British Reform Bill, culminating in the constitutional settlements that followed the wave of revolution and counter-revolution of 1848, and in the colonies through the wars of independence, extending from the American Revolution through the Latin American revolutions of the 19th century to the anti-colonial movements that followed the Second World War. Its completion depended on the extension of the franchise to the working class. However, the extension of the franchise depended on the extension of the franchise depended on the ability of the state to confine the political aspirations of the working class within the constitutional limits of the liberal state form. The limits of the liberal state form. The struggle for the vote was the last stage in the struggle of the bourgeoisie for emancipation from the autocratic state. However, it was only the first stage in the struggle of the working class for the working class's emancipation from property. The working class sought to use its organized strength and its constitutional rights as the means of asserting its social claims. The struggle of the working class was a struggle for social democracy. But the working class struggle focused inevitably on the state. For political economy, the adequacy of the liberal state form was ensured by the adequacy of money and the law as the means of reconciling the particular interests of capital with the general interests of society through the rule of the market. However, political economy failed to grasp the contradictory form of capitalist production that appears in the tendency to overaccumulation of capital. The overaccumulation of capital appears in the constant pressure of competition, through which capitalists are forced to hold down wages, intensify labor, and replace living labor by machines, through which pre-capitalist social forms are destroyed, backward capitals displaced, and workers discarded, and which leads to the eruption of ever more violent crises, through which production is confined within the limits of production's capitalist form. The struggle of the working class brought to the fore the contradictions at the heart of the capitalist state, because the capitalist state's class character. The struggle of the working class brought to the fore the contradiction at the heart of the capitalist state between the capitalist state's class character and the capitalist state's universalistic claims. The underlying contradiction of the capitalist mode of production does not appear immediately as such. The underlying contradiction of the capitalist mode of production appears to individual capitals as profits are squeezed between the pressure of competition and the resistance of the working class. The underlying contradictions of the capitalist mode of production does not appear immediately as such. The underlying contradiction of the capitalist mode of production appears to individual capitals as profits are squeezed between the pressure of competition and the resistance of the working class. Capitalists seek to overcome the barrier of competition by the socialization of production and the restructuring of capitalist property relations, The concentration and centralization of capital led to the development of the limited liability company, in which capital is divorced from the person of the capitalist and becomes an independent social power, to the emergence of the giant corporation, within which production is not regulated by the market, but by forms of bureaucratic management and financial regulation, and to the centralization of the banking system, through which the ownership of capital is socialized, and the accumulation of capital freed from the limits of the market. However, the socialization of capitalist production and of capitalist property still takes place within the social relations of capitalist production, and the development of social production remains subordinate to the expanded reproduction of capital. Far from dissolving the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, the socialization of production within the capitalist mode of production concentrates the autocratic power of capital and intensifies the crisis tendencies of capital accumulation. The concentration of capital fosters the development of trade unionism, as it brings workers together in larger units. Trade unions overcome the divisions between workers imposed by the rule of money and the individualism of the law to mobilize the collective strength of the working class to resist capitalist attempts to force down wages and intensify labor in the face of increased competition, and to take advantage of favorable conditions to raise the wages of sections of the working class. Although trade unionism provides a basis on which workers can develop their subjective and organizational unity and formulate their democratic aspirations, the continued subordination of civil society to the rule of money and the limits Although trade unionism provides a basis on which workers can develop their subjective and organizational unity and formulate their democratic aspirations, the continued subordination of civil society to the rule of money and the law limits the ability of the working class to realize the working class's aspirations through trade unionism and reinforces divisions within the working class. In such circumstances, the only social power that appears to be able to constitute the unity of society and to realize the democratic aspirations of the working class by bringing social production under democratic control is the state. As Marx noted, so long as the state appears to be the only institutionalized form of human social power, the state continues to express, quote, within the limits of its form, as a particular kind of state, all social struggles, end quote. The socialization of production defines the objective conditions for the transcendence of the capitalist. The socialization of production defines the objective conditions for the transcendence of the capitalist mode of production. The collective organization of the working class provides the social force whose democratic aspirations can only be realized by abolishing the contradictory form of capitalist production. However, the creation of a democratic form of social production can only be achieved by overcoming the alienated forms of capitalist economic and political domination. The emancipation of the working class can only be achieved through a social and political revolution that will overcome the separation of the state from civil society to create a new form of society in which, quote, man recognizes and organizes his own powers, quote, as social forces, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the shape of a political power, or of political power, not apolitical power. Political power, full stop. Quote, as social forces, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the shape of political power, end quote. The response of the state to the working class challenge is not determined simply by the political character of the regime, but is inscribed in the contradictory character of the liberal form of the state. The state responds to the aspirations of the working class, quote, within the limits of its form as a particular kind of state, end quote. The attempt of the working class to assert its democratic claims on the basis of its collective strength appears to the state not as a means of transcending the limits of its form, but as a challenge to its legal power and constitutional authority. The reproduction of the state requires that it responds to such a challenge not by abdicating its power, but by reasserting its authority. However, the state cannot simply resort to repression without opening up the contradiction between the class character and the universalistic form of the state, and risking a revolutionary confrontation in which the state confronts the working class as the organized power of capital. The state has to resolve this contradiction by responding to the substantive aspirations of the working class, while attempting to confine the workers' pursuits of those aspirations within the limits of the Constitution through a judicious combination of concession and repression that aims above all to separate the workers' pursuit of their material aspirations from their assertion of their democratic claims by separating the industrial struggles of the working class on the basis of its collective strength from its political struggles on the basis of the constitutional forms provided for it, thereby undermining the emerging unity of the working class and subordinating it to the substantive power of capital on the one hand, and securing the purely formal character of democracy on the other. The separation of the state from civil society and the subordination of social production to the reproduction of capital immediately implies that the ability of the state to respond to the material aspirations of the working class is confined, directly or indirectly, within the limits of capital, for the reproduction of the capitalist state ultimately presupposes the reproduction of capital, and the state eventually confronts barriers to the expanded reproduction of capital as barriers to the state's own reproduction. Thus, the state sponsored the development of new social institutions through which the state could respond to the material aspirations of the working class while reinforcing the social reproduction of the working class in its subordination to the money power of capital and the constitutional authority of the state. The working class and the state. The development of capitalism involved the transition from the patriarchal relations of dependence of pre-capitalist society to the monetary relations of subordination characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. However, the working class constantly resisted its subordination to the power of money. In the early stages of capitalist development, such resistance took the form of sporadic outbursts of civil disorder, which could escalate into localized insurrection in periods of acute distress. Although such unrest might put the limited resources of the state under serious pressure, such unrest could normally be contained by the provision of poor relief, the protection of hard-pressed branches of production, particularly agriculture, and by military and police repression. The growth of an organized working class movement presented a more permanent challenge to the state. On the one hand, the collective organization of the working class undermined the residual ties of authoritarian paternalism. On the other hand, the collective organization of the working class proved a more pervasive, insidious threat to the power of capital and the authority of the state. Capital responded to the challenge by developing new forms of hierarchical organization of the labor process, which offered higher pay and status to the better organized, skilled workers, by developing incentive payment systems that tied pay more closely to the profitability of the enterprise, and by accommodating trade unions within new systems of, quote, industrial relations. However, such an accommodation was a double-edged weapon. While such an accommodation enabled the better-placed employers to stabilize their labor relations, the accommodation also enabled the trade unions to consolidate their organization, to provide a base from which to resist attempts by employers to erode their gains when the pressure of overaccumulation put profitability at risk, and to build a wider class unity to pursue not only the sectional aims of particular groups of workers, but the democratic aspirations of the working class as a whole. While the state could not meet the challenge of civil disorder with a combination of repression and relief, the state had to respond to the political challenge of the organized working class by making more fundamental concessions through which it could accommodate the working class within the Constitution. These concessions involved the rigorous separation of the legitimate exercise of collective strength of the working class within the industrial sphere on the one hand, and its pursuit of its democratic social aspirations in the political sphere on the other. The former concern led the state to recognize the legal rights of trade unions and to sponsor the generalization of, quote, industrial relations, which provided a constitutional channel through which the working class could pursue its unavoidably class-based trade union aspirations while reinforcing sectional divisions and reproducing the subordination of the working class to the wage form. The latter concern led the state to develop institutions through which it could respond to the wider material aspirations of the working class, within the limits of the liberal state form, through the socialization of the reproduction of the working class, the reinforcement of family dependence, and the more active involvement of the state in the regulation of the wage relation. Social reform, in quotes, involved the development of a system of, quote, social administration, which categorized and fragmented the working class in the attempt to confine the working class within the limits of the forms of the wage and the family, while providing education, housing, health, and welfare benefits. Industrial relations and social administration responded to the material aspirations of the working class, but the price the working class paid for such material concessions was the more rigorous and systematic subordination of the working class's social reproduction to the demands of capital, and the fragmentation of working class unity through sectional trade unionism and the differentiated forms of social administration. The working class could not turn its back on these institutions, for they were the only means through which individual workers could secure their physical and social reproduction. Nevertheless, the working class constantly sought to transcend these forms. Workers individually and collectively resisted the intrusive, degrading, humiliating, and often overtly repressive administration of social reform, and demanded the more liberal and generous dispensation of relief. Workers refused to confine their aspirations within the limits of capital imposed through the system of industrial relations. Women resisted their subordination within the form of the family, struggling not only against men who were the immediate sources of their oppression, but also against the state, whose social policies played an increasing role in reproducing and reinforcing that subordination. Through such industrial and social struggles, the working class constantly sought to break through the attempts of capital and the state to confine its aspirations within the limits of the systems of industrial relations and social administration, overcoming the division imposed on the working class by such forms to develop an emerging political unity. Thus, the generalization of industrial relations and the development of a system of social administration did not contain the class struggle, but gave the class struggle new dimensions and new forms. The political agitation of the working class resulted from the inability of capital and the state to meet its social aspirations through the alienated forms of the wage and social welfare. So long as the state restricted the franchise, workers would continue to pursue their social aspirations by mobilizing politically on the basis of their collective strength, and so would represent a permanent threat to the constitutional stability of the state, which could only be met by generalized repression, undermining the legitimacy of the state by bringing to the fore the contradiction between the state's class character and the state's democratic claims, and threatening to escalate into a revolutionary confrontation. The extension of the franchise did not in itself threaten the power of capital, for the power of capital was not embodied in the capital's privileged access to state power, but in the liberal form of the state. However, the extension of the franchise would provide constitutional channels through which the working class could consolidate the power of trade unions by an extension of their legal rights, improve their conditions of protective and minimum wage legislation, secure more generous welfare provision without regard to the profitability of capital or the financial resources at the disposal of the state. The fear of the bourgeoisie was that such working-class aspirations could be fueled by populist politicians who could seek election on the basis of grandiose promises which could only be fulfilled by raising taxation or through the inflationary expansion of credit. It was the fear of such populist inflationism, articulated by the currency reformers in Britain, by the Proudhonists in France, and to more effect by agrarian populism in the United States, as much as of the direct challenge to the sanctity of property that lay behind the caution with which even the most democratic of liberals approached the question of the franchise. The foundations of the political stabilization of the liberal state form on the basis of the admission of the working class to the franchise were laid by the accommodation of the trade unions to the wage form within the emerging system of industrial relations, the accommodation of the working class within the system of social administration through the sufficiently generous provision of relief and the political incorporation of the various fractions of the petty bourgeoisie as a counterweight to the electoral strength of the working class. The material conditions for the accommodation of the working class in the more advanced centers of accumulation were laid by the growth of productivity associated with the generalization of more advanced methods of production in the second half of the 19th century, particularly in agriculture and transport, that reconciled rising real wages with the profitability of capital, relieved the pressure on the system of poor relief by absorbing the surplus population, and that expanded the financial resources at the disposal of the state. The political counterweight to the working class was provided by the old middle class of petty producers and the new middle class of professional, scientific, and administrative workers. In mainland Britain, the political weight of petty producers had been much reduced by the extinction of the peasantry and the destruction of the dominant branches of domestic industry. Elsewhere, the incorporation of the petty producers, threatened with extinction by capitalist competition, was achieved by the gradual transition from pre-capitalist forms of paternalistic dependence to modern forms of political patronage on the basis of the selective protection of the affected branches of production, particularly agriculture, from the full force of competition. The cost paid by capital for such concessions was that they tended to inflate wages by inflating the price of the means of subsistence, while they also bolstered the political privileges of backward landed and commercial capitalists by protecting the sources of their revenues and the basis of their social power. But this was a small price to pay for securing the stabilization of the liberal state form. The generalization of capitalist production destroyed the old middle class, but at the same time, the concentration and centralization of capital, the separation of mental from manual labor, the growth of private and public bureaucracies, and the expansion of social administration provided the basis for the rapid growth of a new middle class, which owed its position not so much to its ownership of its requisite means of production as to its educational and professional qualifications and expertise. Its privileged income and status derived in part from its position of authority within bureaucratic hierarchies. But it preserved its privileges by restricting access to the appropriate educational and professional institutions through which it bestowed qualifications on itself, in the name not of sectional trade unionism, but of intellectual and professional standards which it alone was competent to adjudicate. The increasing routinization of bureaucratic tasks, the development of a division of intellectual labor, and the expansion of public education threatened to erode the privileges of the professional middle class. Its ability to resist such an erosion by maintaining restricted access to advanced education and by securing legal endorsement for professional qualifications was determined in part by the fact that the state apparatus and the education system was itself staffed by elements of that class, but was primarily determined by its significance as a social and political counterweight to the advance of the working class. The progressive extension of the franchise assimilated the working class to the Constitution by providing a form through which workers could pursue their aspirations not as workers but as individual citizens. The individuality of workers as citizens was defined by their differentiated interest as particular categories of worker, as consumers, as taxpayers, as consumers of public services, and as recipients of welfare benefits. Thus, the extension of the franchise provided the form through which the state could foster the political recomposition of the working class on the basis of such differentiated interests, within the context of the political unity, not of the class but of the nation. The democratic franchise correspondingly legitimated the repression of attempts of workers to pursue their aims outside the legal and constitutional framework of the liberal state form by all the means at the disposal of the state. Thus, the extension of the franchise completed the development of the institutional forms through which the working class was assimilated to the wage relation and the liberal state form, institutionalizing the dual strategy of repression and concession in the constitutional form of the liberal democratic state. It is essentially these institutions, whose developed forms were systematically rationalized in the, quote, welfare state, that have defined the continuing relationship between the state and the working class. Although the class struggle has developed through the institutional forms of industrial relations, social administration, and electoral representation, it has never been confined within those forms. The political stabilization of the liberal state form can only ever be provisional, for the crisis-ridden tendency of capital accumulation constantly creates new barriers to the attempts of workers to secure their physical and social reproduction and to realize their democratic aspirations, and impose new limits on the ability of capital and the state to respond to the workers' aspirations within the institutional forms through which they seek to accommodate the working class to the reproduction of capitalist domination. Thus, the class struggle constantly overflows the institutional forms provided for it. The development of the capitalist state form is correspondingly not determined by the unfolding of historical laws, but nor the functional adaptation of the state to the, quote, needs of capital, but of the development of the class struggle, which is not simply a struggle for state power, nor a struggle between the organized working class and the power of the state, but a struggle over the form of the state, conducted in and against the differentiated institutional forms of capitalist domination. The institutional forms of industrial relations, social administration, and the democratic franchise were the means by which the state sought to decompose the emerging organizational unity of the working class in order to recompose the working class politically. However, these forms did nothing to counter the underlying cause of the class struggle that lies in the contradictory form of capitalist production. While the sustained accumulation of capital increased the mass of surplus value, which enabled capital to meet demands for rising real wages, which provided rising revenues to finance the growth of public expenditure, the state could respond to the demands of the working class within the limits of its form. However, as the overaccumulation of capital led to the devaluation of capital, intensified industrial conflict, the destruction of productive capacity, the redundancy of labor, and the pauperization of a growing mass of the population, the demands made on the state increased, while the resources at its disposal contracted. The political forms of industrial relations and social administration institutionalized working-class expectations of stable wages and a minimum level of subsistence, while electoral representation provided the means by which the working class could impose such expectations on the state. The stability of the state was therefore increasingly dependent on the state's ability to ameliorate the impact of the overaccumulation of capital by intervening more actively in the regulation of accumulation. Such intervention was not simply a, quote, economic, but also a deeply political matter, as the state sought to respond to the economic and political impact of overaccumulation to secure its economic, political, and ideological production within the limits of its contradictory form as a class state, but also as a national state. Overaccumulation, class struggle, and the nation-state. The tendency to overaccumulation is a global phenomenon, as capital tries to overcome the barrier of the limited domestic market by seeking out markets on a global scale. However, the capitalist state is constituted on a national basis. The concern of the state is not with the global accumulation of capital, but with securing the accumulation of domestic productive capital at a pace sufficient to absorb the surplus population, provide stable or rising wages, and growing public revenues. With the rise of social reform and the extension of the franchise, the state became increasingly concerned with the issue of, quote, national efficiency, which involved the creation of a healthy, educated, and enterprising labor force, the development of systems of industrial finance, the fiscal encouragement of investment, the promotion of scientific research, and a range of infrastructural investments. However, the intervention of the nation-state in promoting the accumulation of domestic productive capital only reinforced the tendencies to the global overaccumulation of capital, while it gave the resulting class and competitive struggles an increasingly political form. There's a footnote. The concept of domestic productive capital, which refers to the geographical location of productive labor, is quite different from that of the, quote, national capital, which is usually used to refer to the portion of global capital in national ownership. The nationality of ownership is itself an ambiguous concept. The term might refer to the very different concepts of the nationality or domicile of individual owners, or to the nationality or domicile of corporate bodies. This ambiguity in itself should be sufficient to indicate the error of attempting to use the concept of national capital to explain the relationship between capital and the state, an approach that suppresses the contradictory character of the relation between global capital and the nation-state. End footnote. The pressure of overaccumulation appears in the form of pressure on profits, intensified industrial conflict, pressure on the banks and financial markets, and rising unemployment, initially in particular branches of production, but as the crisis grows, the pressure extends to all branches of production. As trade unions come into conflict with the repressive powers of the courts and the police, and the unemployed come into conflict with the repressive forms of poor relief, the class struggle takes on a directly political form and threatens to overflow the constitutional channels provided for the class struggle. At the same time, the scope for material concessions is narrowed as profits are squeezed, and as the state faces a fiscal crisis, as revenues fall while expenditure rises, a financial crisis, as the state has difficulty funding its debt on hard-pressed financial markets, and a monetary crisis in the face of speculation against the currency and a drain on the reserves. The orthodox response in the face of such a crisis was for the state to pursue deflationary monetary policies to restore financial and monetary stability, and to confine accumulation within the limits of the market. This is the course advocated by political economy and generally adopted in Europe in the middle decades of the 19th century, when crises tended to be short and sharp and recovery relatively rapid, while working-class resistance tended to be localized and sporadic. However, exclusive reliance on such a deflationary response became politically untenable in the more severe global crises of overaccumulation after 1870, and as the organizational and institutional basis of working-class resistance in and against the state became more developed. Thus, the state had to develop new forms of intervention in the attempt to reduce the domestic impact of the crisis. However, the possibilities of intervention available to the state were constrained by the economic pressures to which the state was subject and by the political struggles to which such intervention might give rise. The obvious alternative to deflationary policies was for the state to adopt expansionary monetary and fiscal policies in response to the clamor for relief. The state can relieve the domestic impact of the crisis at a stroke by using the state's monetary powers to stimulate the expansion of credit. Credit expansion eases the pressure on the banks and financial markets, enabling the state to meet its financial needs and cover its spending, and relieving the pressures on capitals. However, unless capitals take advantage of such an expansionary environment to transform methods of production to improve their international competitive position, the expansion of credit will stimulate inflation and lead to a deterioration in the balance of trade. Inflation threatens to provide domestic and industrial and political. Inflation threatens to provoke domestic, industrial, and political conflict, as it erodes wages and devalues rentier capital, and to provoke speculation against the currency. The limits to the ability of the state to resolve the crisis by such expansionary means appear in the form of the political conflicts unleashed by escalating inflation on the one hand and financial pressures of deteriorating external position on the other. Although inflationism presented a grave threat to property and to the financial and political stability of the state, its immediate benefits made it very attractive to opportunistic politicians, an attraction that was considerably increased with the extension of the franchise and the beginnings of social reform. It was this fear that had led to the general adoption of the gold standard and the doctrine of the balanced budget as constitutional guarantees by the leading capitalist powers in the last quarter of the 19th century. The principles of the balanced budget and the gold standard meant that the limit to expansionary policies was set at the national level by the gold reserves and globally by the supply of gold. The possibility of overcoming these limits appeared to lie in the possibility of overcoming the barrier of the limited supply and commodity form of world money. This possibility was expressed in the 19th century by bimetallism, which proposed to add silver to gold as a form of world money. However, the association of bimetallism with popular inflationism and the reluctance of the world's financial centers to see their monopoly of gold undermined kept bimetallism in check. The rise of sterling as a world currency, based on its guaranteed convertibility into gold that was underpinned by the financial strength of the City of London, provided a more flexible basis for the growth of world liquidity and the internationalization of money capital, while keeping control of the world monetary system in, quote, responsible hands. The internationalization of credit money, with the rise of global exchange standards, made it possible to ease domestic and international political tensions by sustaining the increasingly inflationary world boom that led up to the First World War. The stability of the currency, the constitutional principles of the gold standard, and the balanced budget, and political opposition to inflationism limited the scope for expansionary solutions to the crisis. However, the state could relieve the domestic impact of a global crisis by intervening directly to relieve domestic productive capital from the pressure of foreign competition by protective tariffs, industrial subsidies, and imperialism. However, such mercantilist policies could relieve the pressure by favoring particular capitals at the expense of others at home and abroad, so threatening to politicize domestic and international competition, the latter inviting foreign retaliation which could easily escalate into diplomatic, political, and military confrontation. Thus, the attempt to resolve the contradiction between the class character and democratic form of the state in the face of an intensification of the domestic class struggle by mobilizing the power of the state in support of domestic productive capital at the expense of foreign competitors merely opens up the contradiction between the global character of accumulation and the national form of the state. Despite the dangers of provoking retaliation, protectionism, and imperialism could immediately ease the domestic impact of a global overaccumulation crisis, foster the nationalist identification of the working class with the state, and create the space within which capital and the state could make the concessions required to recompose the working class politically. In the face of a growing political challenge from the working class, within and outside the Constitution, the appeal of such a strategy to politicians and to capitalists facing extinction could prove irresistible. Once adopted, however, such policies tended to acquire their own momentum. Nationalist and imperialist sentiments, once unleashed, were powerful ideological forces, and militarism promised enormous profits for the relevant branches of production, to say nothing of militarism's attraction to the military. Thus, the rise of protectionism and imperialism from the late 1870s and again in the 1930s created the tensions that culminated in the First and Second World Wars. Protectionism was not only threatens to unleash the forces of nationalism and militarism, protectionism also disrupts the integration of domestic accumulation by disrupting the relationship between the various branches of production. Thus, protectionism has generally been associated with the increasingly direct intervention of the state in the regulation of accumulation. Such direct intervention to replace the market by the state-sponsored rationalization and monopolization of production and the coordinated planning of production and investment is the most obvious means of overcoming the tendency to overaccumulation, since it gets to the root of the problem, freeing the development of social production from the limits of its capitalist form. However, direct intervention also raises the question of the form of the state. The direct involvement of the state in production oversteps the boundaries between the state and civil society, integrating the powers of capital and the power of the state, as the state exercises its power in support of particular capitals, raising the questions of the neutrality of the state and the democratic accountability of capital, and setting precedents for future intervention. The integration of capital and the state threatens to integrate the social and political struggles of the working class, as trade unionism brings workers directly into conflict with the state, while the political advance of the working class holds out the possibility of its bringing social production under democratic control. The possibility of direct intervention and forms that such intervention takes is therefore constrained by the balance of class forces and by the latitude available for capital and the state to make concessions to the working class sufficient to contain the class struggle within the capitalist state form. Wherever accumulation arises in branches of production protected from foreign competition, it tends to take the form of chronic and persistent surplus capacity, which can be eliminated by the monopolization and rationalization of production, while the freedom to control prices enables such monopolies to make substantive concessions to the workers in order to contain the class struggle. This was generally the course adopted at an early stage in the development of gas, water, and electricity supply, the post and the telegraph, and in the domestic transport system. Economists provided the theory, quote, of public services, unquote, public utilities, that could explain the exceptional character of such industries and so serve as an ideological barrier to using those industries as a precedent for the generalization of public ownership. Overaccumulation in domestic agriculture was similarly combated by the price support schemes or by cooperative marketing arrangements, reinforced by subsidies or tariff protection. Political considerations have meant that state-sponsored monopolization has usually been associated with public regulation or public ownership to prevent particular capitals from exercising their monopoly powers against other capitals, and with a degree of responsiveness and accountability of management not only to the priorities of the state, but also to the aspirations of the workforce for stable employment and improved working conditions, if not always for reasonable wages, particularly if public employment was tacitly used as a means of absorbing the surplus population and as an instrument of political patronage. The state has attempted to reconcile its direct intervention in production with the state's liberal form by distancing such intervention from the political sphere, reproducing the separation of the state from civil society within the state apparatus, typically in the form of the public corporation and of the tripartite representation of the interests of trade unions, capitalists, and the state on consultative and regulatory bodies. Where overaccumulation arises in branches of production that face foreign competition in domestic or world markets, competitive pressure imposes more severe constraints on the intervention of the state in the rationalization of production, in particular reducing the scope for concessions to the working class to accommodate the workforce, to the intensification of labor and the displacement of living labor by machines required to strengthen international competitiveness. Where the branches of production in question command the world market surplus profits can provide the scope for such concessions. However, in the face of growing competitive pressure, the contradictions of state intervention come to the fore as the industrial struggle is increasingly politicized, threatening not only the class character but also the liberal form of the capitalist state. It is such political fears, as much as concern for the interests of capitalists, that have made politicians reluctant to intervene directly in production. Where such intervention is already established, the state has tended to respond to the political pressures created by a crisis of overaccumulation, alternatively, by withdrawing from the sphere of production, by, quote, privatizing public monopolies and submitting them to the tender mercies of the market, or by relieving the pressure of competition by adopting mercantilist policies at the cost of raising taxation and domestic prices and increasing international tensions. Thus, the direct intervention of the state in production has reinforced tendencies to economic nationalism, protectionism, and imperialism. The forms of intervention of the state in the regulation of accumulation have not been determined simply by the needs of capital, nor by the need to subordinate capital to the growth of production, but by the attempt of the state to resolve the contradiction between the tendency for capital to expand forces of production without limit and capital's need to confine growth of production within the limits of its capitalist form. This contradiction does not appear to the state immediately, but is mediated politically, appearing in the attempt of the state to overcome the contradiction inherent in its form as both a class and a national state. Before the First World War, the direct intervention of the state in production was largely confined to public utilities, although parts of the German coal and steel industries were in public ownership, despite capitalist pressure to privatize the industries. With the outbreak of war, the capitalist form of production presented an increasing barrier to the war effort. However, the state regulation of international trade in wartime protected capital from foreign competition, while popular nationalism secured the political integration of the working class, and the demands of the military provided unlimited outlets for the products of capital, creating conditions under which the state could take direct control over capitalist production without immediately politicizing the class struggle. However, resistance to the war grew and increasingly assumed a class character, particularly in the autocratic European states. The interventionist apparatus provided a basis on which the social and political struggles of the working class were fused in the struggle for state power. Although only the Russian Revolution survived the counter-revolutionary offensive, revolutionary and insurrectionary movements based on the strength of the organized working class spread throughout the capitalist world. The immediate revolutionary threat was met with repression, while the state accommodated the immediate aspirations of the working class with inflationism, which generated new conflicts in its turn. The political conflicts unleashed by the wartime intervention in production and post-war inflation reinforced the orthodox commitment to monetary stability embodied in the gold standard and to the rule of the market in the regulation of accumulation. However, the lesson drawn by both capital and the state from the experience was the urgent need to remove the barriers to the global accumulation of capital, the disruption of which had intensified both class and national conflict. These barriers had appeared most dramatically in the monetary crisis that had forced national governments to adopt deflationary policies or to resort to protection in order to defend the currency, which then reverberated through the world in a deflationary or protectionist spiral. These barriers could be removed by rebuilding the international monetary system that would provide the international liquidity required to finance imbalances of international payments and so permit national governments to dismantle the apparatus of wartime intervention and sustain accumulation by expansionary policies within the framework of the restored gold standard. The construction of the gold exchange standard was therefore the cornerstone of the attempt to reconstitute the liberal state form in the aftermath of war and revolution. The gold exchange standard, indeed, led to an enormous growth in international liquidity. However, the expansion of credit stimulated the renewed overaccumulation of capital and an increasingly inflationary boom that culminated in the crash of 1929. Meanwhile, the gold exchange standard had not overcome the contradiction between the global character of accumulation and the national form of the state. Despite the growth of international credit, national currencies still came under pressure in the face of a drain on the reserves and speculation against the currency, while an overstrong currency threatened to generate inflationary pressures. Rather than allow free rein to the destabilizing forces of the specie flow mechanism, national governments were tempted to manipulate exchange rates and interest rates and to sterilize reserves in pursuit of national policy aims, weakening the gold exchange standard, which finally collapsed in 1931. The collapse of the international financial system reinforced the recession that had followed the 1929 crash. The contraction of credit led to the deflationary spiral that plunged the world into acute depression and led to a resurgence of protectionism and militarism, which culminated in the Second World War. The Second World War merely reinforced the lessons of the First, and the priorities of the post-war Reconstruction were very similar. The interwar failure of liberalization was attributed to the failure to address the political issue of nationalism and imperialism, to the failure sufficiently to liberalize trade, and above all to the weakness of the gold exchange standard. The reconstruction of the international monetary system on a more secure foundation was seen from an early stage in the war as the key to post-war reconstruction. The immediate post-war political challenge of the working class was accommodated variously by inflationism and by political concessions, but the political and economic priority was to reconstruct a liberal world order in which the growth of international credit would allow national governments to pursue expansionary policies by accommodating imbalances of international payments. Sustained accumulation would in turn permit the liberalization of trade that would undermine economic nationalism and the rising wages, high levels of employment, and improved standards of welfare provision that would secure the political incorporation of the working class. The prime architect of the reconstructed international monetary system was Keynes. The expansionary strategies that the system permitted became known as Keynesianism, and the institutional form of the liberal state associated with such strategies was commonly referred to as the, quote, Keynesian welfare state. It remained to be seen whether Keynes' plans would at last allow capital to overcome the tendencies to overaccumulation and allow the state to overcome the limits of its class character and its national form, or whether Keynesianism would prove to be merely a recipe for global inflationism, as the expansion of credit stimulated the increasingly inflationary overaccumulation of capital on a world scale. Economics, politics, and the ideology of the state. The increasing intervention of the state in civil society raised not only political but also ideological questions. The legitimacy of the liberal democratic state depends only, in the last instance, on its formal claim to a monopoly of political authority and legitimate violence. Its everyday legitimacy rests on the more solid basis of its substantive claim to exercise its powers in the general interest. The class character of the state means that such claims are necessarily ideological, but the ideology of the state is a powerful political force in confining politics within the limits of the Constitution. Moreover, the ideology of the state gives coherence to the diverse policies and institutions through which the state accommodates the pressures to which it is subjected. The ideology of the state consequently has its own momentum. Once adopted, a particular ideology serves in its turn as a constraint on the activities of the state, as the latter seeks to secure not only its material and political, but also its ideological reproduction. As we have seen in the case of mercantilism, the state may cling to the dominant ideology long past the point at which the balance of social and political forces that it articulates has dissolved, testing it to destruction and beyond. As the economic and political pressures on the state mount, and an outmoded ideology becomes a barrier to the reproduction of the state, the political crisis of the state gives rise to an ideological crisis, at which point the state seeks out a new ideology to articulate and legitimate policies and institutions dictated by new social and political circumstances. Political economy had legitimated a regime of laissez-faire. This, by no means, implied the passivity of the state, but rather the subordination of all particular interests to the anonymous rule of money and the law. Such subordination required the systematic rationalization of the state apparatus and the centralization of political power rigorously to enforce the rule of money and the law. In practice, political expediency dictated the increasingly extensive intervention of the state in substantive matters. However, political economy could accommodate such interventions ideologically as exceptions However, political economy could accommodate such interventions ideologically as exceptions to its. I don't know. I think it's supposed to say rule there, but there's looks like there's a missing word. Exceptions to its rule that were necessary, but not because of the failures of money and the law, but because of human ignorance and moral weakness that subverted their operation. Political economy had established its ideological dominance in Britain by the middle of the 19th century, as liberalism bore fruit in the mid-Victorian boom. Elsewhere, the truth of political economy continued to face resistance from a romantic conservatism that sought to preserve pre-capitalist patriarchal relations, populist inflationism that defended petty producers from the money power of capital, positivistic socialism that saw the state enforcing the rule not of money and the law, but of science and technology, and nationalistic protectionism that saw the nation-state as a mercantilist weapon in pursuit of national prosperity, the continued social power of the landed class, the strength of the petty bourgeoisie, and the persistence of mercantilist industrial and commercial policies in the face of global penetration of British capital were the social and political forces behind such ideologies. However, the rapid generalization of capitalist production, associated particularly with the expansion of railways, brought liberalism to the fore from the 1840s, although nowhere did it establish a dominance to match that achieved in Britain. By the 1870s, political economy had been reduced to a set of dogmas that had little bearing on the substantive political issues of the day. While the doctrines of the gold standard and the balanced budget were hardly challenged, the rise of social reform and the recognition of trade unionism undermined political economy's analytical foundations, while protectionism in Europe undermined the dogma of free trade. The extension of the franchise, the beginnings of social reform, and the rise of protectionism and imperialism called for new ideologies to articulate and legitimate the competing interventionist strategies at the disposal of the state. The new ideologies often drawing on older traditions. However, the growing challenge of socialism made it imperative, both politically and ideologically, that the state set limits to such intervention. These limits were articulated ideologically by the new economics that emerged from the marginalist revolution. The marginalist economics rejected the dogmatism of political economy, but marginalist economics did not overturn political economy's theoretical foundations and reinforce the orthodox commitment to the principles of the gold standard and the balanced budget. The fate of the new economics was therefore intimately associated with the fate of the attempt to overcome the contradictory tendencies of accumulation by the liberalization of the international trade and monetary systems after the First World War. The crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression undermined this liberal strategy and led to the rise of corporatist alternatives in the form of the state capitalism of fascism, the state socialism of communism, which presented not only a political but also an ideological challenge to liberalism. The liberal response to this challenge was Keynesianism, which proposed to overcome the limits of orthodoxy by abandoning its most cherished principles. The gold standard would be replaced by a managed system of international money and credit, and the balanced budget by discretionary fiscal policy. The new Keynesian principles reconciled the sustained accumulation of domestic productive capital with the sustained accumulation of capital on a global scale on the basis of rising mass consumption and the growth of international credit. Although the state has developed in different countries on the basis of historically different class structures and different political and ideological traditions, the state's historical development has increasingly been dominated by the uneven impact of the tendency to overaccumulation and even uneven development of capital on a world scale. In the following chapters, I intend to trace in more detail the development of the capitalist state form, culminating in an examination of the political and ideological crisis of the Keynesian welfare state by concentrating on the British example. However, the aim is to draw out the issues of general comparative and theoretical significance by abstracting from the contingent elements in the British experience that derive from idiosyncratic elements of British historical traditions and class configurations, the personalities of particular politicians, or the contingency of political privilege and political influence. Such factors are important for a full explanation of the strategies adopted by the British state, but are a distraction from the purpose of the present study, which is concerned above all by the constraints imposed on such strategies, by the contradictory form of capital accumulation and the contradictory form of the liberal state.